Hello, everybody, and welcome to Narativ. In South Korea this week, the specter of authoritarianism briefly materialized when Prime Minister Yoon declared martial law. Although it lasted only a matter of hours, Yoon felt emboldened by the incoming Trump administration, knowing there'd be very little opposition to his authoritarian power grab coming from the incoming administration. While democratic forces prevailed in South Korea this time, the situation is very different in Ukraine. In Kyiv, we witnessed something previously unthinkable. Volodymyr Zelenskyy appeared to blink against Putin.
I understand completely your position. It is interesting, though, because it seems to me you have moved to a point that if you could get your NATO membership, you would have accept that we could be moving into a ceasefire and potential talks, peace talks. And at some point in the future, you would consider diplomatically how to get your land back. That's quite a big step, because you're never going to accept that it's Russia's, but as you say, physically, they will hold it. But it could bring the war to a close.
A lot of different countries proposed a ceasefire. So the question is, ceasefire where? That is the question. The second point is, if we speak ceasefire, guarantees that Putin will not come back. And in this case, I commented you about NATO. Yes, NATO immediately the part of Ukraine. We need it very much. Otherwise, he will come back. Otherwise, how we can go to ceasefire? So it's for us, it's very dangerous. That's what I meant.
Zelenskyy has steadfastly maintained Ukraine's right to full territorial integrity since Russia's invasion. But now, in a new apparent concession, Zelenskyy says he is willing to consider temporary Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory. This marks a dramatic shift in position, one that reveals both the mounting pressure on Ukraine's military and democracy and the growing recognition of the evaporating Western resolve. The Trump administration is stumbling over itself in floating peace proposals that align with Russian interests. Even before taking office, Trump even dispatched his new advisor, General Kellogg, to the Kremlin, only to be dismissed by Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. But don't read Putin's dismissal as a rejection of diplomacy. It's just another calculated message. Why rush into negotiations when military realities and global dynamics are increasingly favoring your objectives? It seems almost unavoidable that we will march into 2025 in the way the world marched into Munich in 1938. The parallels with Neville Chamberlain's appeasement are striking. Just as Chamberlain convinced himself that sacrificing part of Czechoslovakia might satisfy Hitler's ambitions, we are watching the potential next U.S. administration craft peace proposals that would effectively validate Putin's territorial conquests. They will embolden him. So get used to it, folks. What we're witnessing now is a seismic shift in the global democratic order. It's the first time we've sacrificed the principles of territorial integrity and democratic self-determination, which really are the cornerstones of the post-World War II international system. And these principles are currently being reconsidered, negotiated away in real time. So yes, elections have consequences, and these developments do not make one feel very good. But before you despair, there is a lesson in the events that just happened in South Korea. It took a unanimous vote of parliament and some street protests. But martial law only lasted 6 hours, and now Prime Minister Yoon faces impeachment. Putin may feel emboldened by recent events and by Zelenskyy's apparent concession, but he is still facing the resolve of the Ukrainian people who have bravely been fighting for over 1,000 days. When people stand up to these paper strongmen, they're often defeated. And when the rule of law is maintained, strongmen will back down. That is the lesson of South Korea. When the American people apply pressure, publicly and through the media, we can urge Donald Trump to protect the people of Ukraine. We can urge him to stand up to Vladimir Putin. And we could urge him to never surrender the principles of democracy to any nation. And we should. Joining us to examine these critical developments is Volodymyr Dubovyk, a senior fellow for democratic resilience at the Center for European Policy Analysis. His recent work on Ukraine's determination to fight and the challenges of maintaining democratic institutions under pressure provides crucial context for understanding the current climate and this pivotal moment. Hello, Volodymyr, and welcome to Narativ. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. Good to be here.
As we look at the events of this week, it does appear to most observers that Volodymyr Zelenskyy has linked in some ways. He's first to suggest that he's willing to allow Russia to keep some of that territory that they've been occupying, and he seems to be willing to negotiate around that. Is that the way you're seeing it, that Zelenskyy has reached that blinking point?
Not necessarily. I see it in a more of a gradual way, as some kind of evolution that he has had over a long period of time, many months now. For the close observer, it's obvious that he's been thinking about this new formats and what can be done right now for a long time. He basically went to US in September and met with President Biden and some others and Mr. Trump, at that point of time candidate for the presidency. And he asked them and other foreign leaders and Western partners for Ukraine what they can do to help Ukraine right now. What kind of assistance can they give? Weapons, financial assistance, what have you. And upon receiving the reply and seeing that there is no massive influx of weapons into Ukraine, he understood that maybe it wouldn't be possible to reach the goal, which was a formal goal and objective for a long time during this full-scale war for Ukrainian leadership, that is to liberate all occupied lands. At least that's not going to be feasible anytime soon. We are seeing Russian troops basically pushing at high expense, paying a huge price in lives, but pushing deeper into Ukraine. So the priority now for Ukraine seems to be to stabilize the front line and stop Russian advance, instead of actually planning some counter-offensive operations and liberating occupied lands. So therefore, Zelenskyy is basically departing or emanating from this understanding of what Ukraine can and can't do and what our partners can provide us to do. And therefore, he is now shifting the focus in discussion with our partners and allies from the issue of this occupied lands, which would Russia probably keep temporarily, obviously, because no one in Ukraine would ever recognize them being part of Russian Federation. But on the issues like keeping sovereignty of Ukraine, for instance, Ukraine being able to make its independent political decisions, including this plan to go maybe to NATO and the EU. And also the question of security guarantees, because the question that Zelenskyy has, okay, Russia currently controls about 20% of our territory. We control 80%. So let's talk about the safety and security of that 80% of Ukrainian territory. What can be done by our partners together with Ukraine to provide more security and make sure that if Russia continues this aggression or maybe takes a pause and then starts another aggression, that Ukraine is better prepared than it was in February of 2022. So the focus now is really on those two issues, like can Ukraine keep its sovereignty to make independent decisions going forward? Also the question of security guarantees.
He does seem to be making NATO membership a key priority. It has been a strategic goal for Ukraine since 2008, but he's saying that he can't see allowing Russia to occupy this territory, this 20%, unless Ukraine is part of NATO. That seems not very likely at this point. You're looking at a scenario where Donald Trump's three proposals, he's got three plans in front of them, none of them suggest that Ukraine be included in NATO. Am I reading that correctly, or is there still a possibility in Ukraine's point of view that they could be invited to NATO?
That's a good question for us, strategically speaking, going forward in terms of our prospects of ensuring our security of the country of Ukraine. The membership in NATO would fit perfectly. That's really the most viable mechanism and format for us, the framework that we are looking for to become a part of this collective security and collective defense arrangement. But you're right, we're knocking on the doors, and the doors are not necessarily shut, closed tight, but they are not open to Ukraine. There have been many promises that Ukraine one day would become a member of NATO, but just not specification of when that might happen. And therefore, there is a discussion now. Can Ukraine be invited right now in the middle of this ongoing war with Russia? Probably not, because there are many member states who would want to become immediately parties to the war against Russia on the side of Ukraine. Mm. Can Ukraine be invited now politically, but not formally? So basically, given this political invitation, but not formal invitation to join the alliance. That is what Zelensky is now insisting on NATO doing. So we'll see if that is possible. But you're right. Of course, Mr. Trump is not fond of this idea of Ukraine joining NATO. Or moreover, he's very skeptical of NATO in general. And we'll see what the administration's policy would be on that account. But in Ukraine, we need to understand that some people in Ukraine are really fed up with some timidity and half measures and spoon feeding from the current administration, the Biden administration. Yes, they're supporting Ukraine. They believe that Ukraine should be supported, but there have been many delays. There have been a lot of fears of escalation by Russia, which prevented Washington from doing the right thing and helping Ukraine at the right moment, at the right time. And therefore, there is a lot of dissatisfaction and even anger in Ukraine. And therefore, people are actually preparing to take a gamble with a new incoming administration, even though Mr. Trump and his people in his inner circle, they are known for making statements skeptical of assistance to Ukraine. But Ukrainians think that when Trump comes to power, that maybe he wouldn't want to throw Ukraine under the bus, that maybe he would be interested in projecting some greatness and strength and not weakness, and that he would actually apply maybe some pressure on Moscow so that Moscow would actually be minimizing or reducing its current ultimatum demands on Ukraine.
In some ways, you will get a more likely end to the war with Trump in power, but will it be one that's beneficial ultimately to Ukraine and to democracy in general around the world? And it seems to me that we might be tiptoeing back to a sort of 1938 appeasement kind of situation where, sure, we'll get some sort of arrangement which will delay the inevitable by a couple of years, maybe a little longer. But are we really going to be seeing an end to this confrontation between these Western democratic states and these authoritarian forces around the world? It doesn't seem to me like we'll be seeing an end to that at all. We'll just be seeing somewhat of a delay.
I agree with you absolutely, wholeheartedly. I think it's very important, not just for my country of Ukraine, not to be overrun by Russia, but I think it's very important to prevent Putin from prevailing in this war for the sake of the entire bigger region, not just post-Soviet space, but in greater Eastern Europe, because a lot of places will be under threat when Russia is done in Ukraine. God forbid they're actually done with Ukraine completely, and they will be on the borders of Poland and Baltic republics like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and if Finland is there as a new member of NATO. There was a good reason for them, both of them, Sweden and Poland and Finland, to join the alliance when Russia attacked Ukraine with a full-scale war in February of 2022. So there will be a lot of trepidation and a serious threat, serious menace to European security and therefore Euro-Atlantic, transatlantic security. So we're hoping that this incoming administration would eventually learn and understand that it is not in the interest of United States to let Ukraine fall. And that's a problem for that. That's going to be a learning moment, an indicating moment. And that's why Ukrainians are trying to talk to this team of Mr. Trump now. And actually both, I believe, Minister of Defense Umerov and also Chief of Office of President Yermak are currently in Washington actually talking to people, including the General Kit Kellogg, who will be probably appointed as the chief representative or high representative or special ambassador on these issues of Ukraine, Russia in the incoming administration. So I think it's very important to explain that American interests are actually involved. Whatever rhetorics they were there when Trump and Republicans were in a position to Biden supporting Ukraine, and part of them not liking support of Ukraine was because Biden was doing it, but now they will be in power. If you remember how Republicans criticized Biden for withdrawing from Afghanistan and how it was done in August of 2021, just imagine what would be said about Trump if Trump lets Ukraine and throws Ukraine under the bus. He would be seen as someone who would be making a detrimental blow to American reputation and American prestige around the globe. So that's what we're hoping on, but we'll see. On the surface of it, is the easiest and shortest way to the peace, which Trump wants, and he wants to end this war, is to apply some pressure on Kyiv, basically saying, sign whatever we have in mind. Otherwise, there'll be no assistance. There'll be no other peace plan. So therefore, the peace that we suggest is not fair. It's probably not durable, but that's the only one that we've got for you, Ukraine. I'm afraid that it might go this way, but hopefully it wouldn't.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Certainly, you look at Germany's build-up in terms of military build-up in the last few years. It certainly seems that they're preparing for another part of this conflict. And if we are in a situation where this is more of a appeasement moment, Trump may go down more as Chamberlain than Churchill, which I think is certainly not where he wants to be, but that's where it seems to be heading towards. Broadly speaking, as you look at, you're in the zone, is Europe preparing for a major world war?
No, they're not. I'm here in Germany, by the way, right now, and many Germans would completely disagree with your previous statement that they're better prepared now for the bigger war than they were 3 years ago. And looking from outside of Europe, like Ukrainians, when we look at what Europe's been doing since February 22, there've been a lot of wasted time, frankly, in terms of military production, military procurement, in terms of training of troops. There've been more of rhetorics and plans announced here and there. Many factories that were planned to be opened back in 22, they're still not opened. The number of artillery shells that Europe produces is very small. It's much smaller than just one country. Russia produces about 1.5 million a year. Europe produces much less. And then North Korea produces about the same number of million a year. So that's 3 million together. That's much more than US, which is a military superpower, produces currently, because they are producing something around 50,000 a month. So that's about 600,000 a year. There are plans to increase the number all the way up to 100,000, maybe through the 2025 in US of artillery shells. But still, the West is basically not prepared for this large war. Like we've seen in the first months of large-scale war that Russia waged on Ukraine, they haven't prepared themselves either. But they have learned on the go, and they've made some lessons and from mistakes from the first months of the war, and now fighting better and now better prepared, and they're mobilizing people, training people better. And they managed, unfortunately, to produce more weapons and circumvent sanctions often and fund the war because they're still selling tons of stuff like natural gas and oil. Therefore, the preparedness of the West is still not that impressive. If you look at the authoritarians versus democracies fight here, then initially it was looking promising for democracies because the Biden administration put together this pro-Ukraine coalition of countries, and they were working together to help Ukraine, and Russia was stalling and basically stumbling in Ukraine. But now, almost 3 years since the start of this full-scale war, it's to the contrary. Democracies are fledgling. People are questioning how long, how much money can we give to Ukraine and so on. Maybe it's time to stop. Maybe it's time to give away land in Ukraine. On the contrary, Russia is very confident and working with China. And of course, we're working very closely with North Korea and Iran. So it's basically an international league of authoritarians who are very much emboldened by what they are seeing. And they think that if they are patient, if they stay the course, then they can outweigh both Ukraine and Ukraine's Western partners.
The only bright silver lining right now is perhaps that the Russian economy is flailing, that the ruble is having some tough weeks. It looks like some of those sanctions are beginning to take greater effect on Russia, but as that is the only silver lining that appears on the horizon right now. It looks to me like democracy is in real trouble. I mean, after the ascent of Donald Trump in January and potentially a defeat, but not a total victory for Ukraine, the notion of democracy is not only lost at the ballot box in biggest democratic country in the world, but also potentially about to face a real defeat militarily.
That's right. Ukraine is in a difficult situation, obviously, and we depend very much so on support that is coming from other countries, not only with weapons, but also with humanitarian assistance. And that's what I'm afraid of, that maybe the new upcoming administration, Trump administration, would actually keep some line of weapon supply to Ukraine, but they would probably be inclined on reducing completely or eliminating completely the humanitarian assistance, which is also very important for Ukraine, for its economy, its government to function. I can see the moment when the Trump administration comes up with some finalized peace plan and shows it to Kremlin and Kyiv, and both probably wouldn't like it at first.
Yeah.
Kremlin would say, we want more. When Ukraine would say, no, we're giving away too much. We're going to just continue to fight. Even if you cut assistance to us, we'll have to fight because this plan is no good to us. So that would be a decisive moment. What Trump and his team does then. Would they try to find leverage to squeeze Putin and drag him to a negotiation table? Or would they rather go the easier way, applying pressure on Ukraine, basically saying, you're now on your own. You can't fight with our weapons. So you better sign this imperfect deal.
Judging from their closeness to the Putin camp, it's pretty easy to see where certainly seems Russia's interference in the US elections was very much on the side of Donald Trump. And as one of their key advisors to Putin said, that they're expecting some payback from the Trump administration. And that payback may come in the form of Ukraine, unfortunately. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. And, I think publicly they'll be seen to be given some posture of strength. But maybe you're right about the arms supply line. That will continue because it's good for the American economy. But it's hard to see a situation where you're going to get a pro-Ukraine or solution in this environment. And that is devastating for so many pro-democracy activists around the world, but specifically to all Ukrainians who've been fighting so hard and who are tired of the fighting and who have been at it for so long, have lost so many people. Tell me, if you could, about how it feels 1,000+ days on after all the sacrifices Ukrainians have made.
It is hard. It's very difficult life. It's surreal still that this is happening. And quite often you would wake up in the morning and say, is this really happening? It is. And we got used to it over almost 3 years now, but still, our lives been interrupted in the most brutal way, in a rough way. And whatever we've been planning and hoping to do and having some plans, there's no plans right now. There is no long-term plans for many Ukrainians. We're just live day to day. We're just hoping to survive with all these drones and missiles flying. I personally haven't been under bombing or anything like that. I'm currently in Germany, but there is no war. But right now, my mind is with Ukraine, and this is a serious test of Ukraine's resilience, because in the early days of the full-scale war, it was probably even easier because we were hoping and seeing that Russian invasion is failing. But right now, the Ukrainian economy is even weaker than before. The resolve of international partners for Ukraine is fledgling, the way we see it. Therefore, people are really tired. There are still millions of people who are internally displaced away from their home somewhere in Ukraine. And there are millions of refugees outside of Ukraine who are willing to come home, but just couldn't do it because the war is still there and the missiles are still flying. And sometimes some of them have nothing to return to. So it is a hard moment, and it is reflected somehow in the sociological polls. Ukrainians are still not in the mood to reward Putin with whatever trophies he wants to get from this war. But you also see more people gradually, slowly, steadily, more people saying, okay, let's maybe negotiate. Let's maybe recognize that some land that Russia occupies, we would not be able to liberate it anytime soon. And Zelenskyy is seeing that shift, and his position is reflecting that shift as well. So he's seeing that public attitude is changing a little bit, and that's why he can allow himself, he can afford actually to start talking about peace. And that's a good thing, because otherwise he wouldn't be in position to do it, because there will be this major gap between the public on one hand and what Zelenskyy is doing and saying on the other.
My hope is that this interview and this broadcast tonight is certainly allows the media and the public in general to understand that what's at stake is really democracy around the world. It's not just what's happening in Ukraine. There has to be some sort of solution to what's going on in Ukraine. There's no doubt about it. But the more we give in to Putin, the more emboldened he becomes, and the more emboldened he will be as he tries to attack other countries around the world militarily, but also through hybrid warfare, as he's been doing to the United States and other countries. There is a lot at stake for freedom in general, democracy in general, and hopefully there is enough public pressure on the Trump administration not to be so pro-Putin, not to give in on all his demands, and to really stand up for people of Ukraine, to show that they're an independent administration that isn't taking orders from the Kremlin, but is actually standing up for itself. And hopefully that begins to be something we hear more from the public and media in general. I thank you very much, Volodymyr. Thanks for being here tonight, and I look forward to having you back on the show in the future.
My pleasure.
One day, you'll tell the story of autocrats, crooks, and kings who came for our freedom. A story of citizens who stood up to tyranny and won. The people prevailed and renewed an old vow to a more perfect union. And that was just the beginning. The story continues. Narativ, where truth lives.